Happy New Year and welcome to our first video of 2024. In this video we're going to discuss 5 common misconceptions and misinformation that I've noticed a lot of drone owners, including Part 107 pilots, don't fully understand. So let's get to it and roll that intro. Yeah, we don't have an intro. Isn't it annoying when there's like 30 seconds of introduction in a video and you just want to get to the information? Let's get to it. Alright, so first up, Part 107 versus hobbyist and recreational pilots. Did you know that Part 107 applies to all drone operators by default? This means that all drone pilots have to abide by the rules of Part 107 when they get their drone. However, the FAA has made one exception to this, and that exception is if the pilot is only flying for recreational or hobby purposes. That is the only way to opt out of Part 107. So what is considered recreational flying? If you go to FAA.gov, the FAA has spelled out on their website what they deem as being recreational versus non-recreational flying. Most people tend to believe that you only need to have a Part 107 certificate if you're making money with your drone. But as the FAA notes on their website, that is not entirely true. Whenever your drone is being used for purposes other than your own personal enjoyment, this could be considered as being non-recreational activity. So does this mean that recreational pilots don't have to abide by any rules or FAA regulations? Well, Congress created the exception for limited recreational operations of unmanned aircraft, it's a long term, to allow those flying drones purely for fun or personal enjoyment to operate without complying with Part 107. People flying under this exception are required to comply with all rules for recreational flyers. 49 U.S.C. 44809 spells out some of these rules, and as you can see, these rules are very similar to Part 107, including maintaining visual line of sight with your drone, altitude limited to 400 feet AGL, aircraft registration requirements, among many others. Number 2 specifically states, the aircraft is operated in accordance with or within the programming of a community-based organization's set of safety guidelines that are developed in coordination with the Federal Aviation Administration. What is a community-based organization, or a CBO? Well, the FAA has several CBOs listed on their website at faa.gov/UAS, with one of the most well-known probably being the Academy of Model Aeronautics, or the AMA. If you click on any of the links under the FAA recognized CBO list, it will take you to that organization's website where you can also view some of the safety guidelines that they have. So when recreational pilots go out to fly, they are expected to follow these safety rules that have been created by some of these CBOs, or community-based organizations. So let's talk about registration. There seems to be a fair amount of confusion over registration since the introduction of the 250 gram or 0.55 pound weight limit. There was a lot of excitement about the 250 gram drones when they first started coming to market because everyone was saying that those drones wouldn't have to be registered. Well, that's true only if you operate that drone for recreational purposes only. Any drone operated under Part 107 must have a registration number on it regardless of weight. The only time a registration number is not needed is when you are flying recreationally under that exception for limited recreational operations rule, and the drone that is being operated is less than 250 grams or 0.55 pounds. So here's a simple diagram that I created that will help you remember when registration is required. Anything operated under Part 107 must have a registration number regardless of weight. If you are operating as a hobbyist and or for recreational purposes, then the drone requires registration if the weight of the drone is 250 grams or greater than 0.55 pounds. If you are a hobbyist or recreational flyer and the drone weighs less than 250 grams or 0.55 pounds or less, that would be the only time that you do not need to register the drone. I've seen a lot of new pilots that think the DJI Geofencing that is built into their drone is what determines whether they are legal to fly in a specific area. Without having a full understanding of FAA rules and regulations, they assume that if the drone lets them take off, then they are allowed to fly in whatever area they happen to be in. Unfortunately, this couldn't be further from the truth. The geofencing that is built into the drone's software is not what determines legality for a flight. There are several other factors that need to be taken into consideration. For instance, if you are in controlled airspace, you would need to get FAA authorization to fly in that airspace prior to taking off. Just because the drone lets you take off without doing anything doesn't necessarily mean you're legal to fly there. In this instance, you would have to get authorization using LAANC or through the FAA's drone zone before you are able to take off. As another example, national parks are typically no-fly zones for drones as well. This could even apply to state or local parks, depending on where you live. However, your drone may still allow you to take off and fly in those areas simply because there may not be any geofencing associated with those parks. Inexperienced pilots may be confused if and when a park ranger then comes up to them and tells them that they cannot fly there. They might say, well, my drone let me take off, so I must be good. But in this instance, it would be because the property owner has the right to refuse drone operations while on their property. If you wanted to fly in the park, it would be wise to first ask for permission to do so. The point of this is to say that the geofencing that is built into the drone is basically there as a safety that is implemented by the drone manufacturer to hopefully help keep you out of trouble. The geofencing does not determine whether or not you are legal or allowed to fly in any area. Just because the drone allows you to fly in an area doesn't necessarily mean that you can. And just because the drone doesn't allow you to fly in an area doesn't necessarily mean that you can't. This leads us into our next topic. Flying in zero-grid airspace. About a year and a half ago, I made a video on the difference between FAA authorizations versus DJI GeoZone unlocking and walking through that process. If you want to watch that video, it should be popping up somewhere up here in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And that goes into more information and detail than what I'm going to get into here. When we look at a LAANC grid, we can easily see what the FAA says we are allowed to fly up to in any given area when within controlled airspace. Here's the FAA's LAANC grid for Cleveland, Ohio. The red numbers in each box tells us that we can get instant authorization through LAANC in those areas. However, when we look a little closer and compare the DJI Geofencing for our drone, and I'm using the geofencing for the Mavic 3 found on the DJI FlySafe website as of January 2024, we can see that the DJI geofencing is actually more restrictive than what the FAA allows in certain areas. If I roughly draw in the restricted DJI geofencing zone onto the LAANC grid for Burke Lakefront Airport, and by the way, a DJI restricted zone is an area that the drone will not take off in unless DJI has unlocked that zone. You as the pilot cannot self-unlock restricted zones like you can with other geo zones. If we look at the DJI restricted area compared to what Burke Lakefront allows us to fly with LAANC authorization, you can see there are several areas that our Mavic 3 will not allow us to fly in without first contacting DJI and providing proof that we have authorization from the FAA to fly there. Even though the FAA or Burke Lakefront Airport says that we can through LAANC. The whole point of this is just to show you that the geofencing that is built into your drone may not always match what the FAA may allow or not allow. This is just one example to illustrate the point I'm trying to make, but I'm sure that there are others out there. Feel free to leave a comment below if you have come across similar situations. It would be interesting to see how many instances of this there really are. In situations like this, where the drone geofencing is more restrictive than what is allowed by the FAA, you would have to get FAA authorization first and then provide that information to DJI in order for them to unlock your drone for that specific area. Again, I go through this in more detail in that previous video that was linked. I'll also link it below towards the comments. Also, just so you are aware, only Part 107 operators can request to fly in a zero-grid LAANC area. Even then, some of these authorization requests for Part 107 operators to operate in a zero grid must be requested through the drone zone. All right, let's talk about the 400-foot rule. As you may or may not know, Part 107 allows for drones to fly up to 400 feet. 107.51 spells out the operating limitations for small unmanned aircraft. Section B says the altitude of the small unmanned aircraft cannot be higher than 400 feet above ground level, unless the small unmanned aircraft, 1, is flown within a 400-foot radius of a structure, and 2, does not fly higher than 400 feet above the structure's immediate uppermost limit. In other words, though the maximum altitude is generally 400 feet AGL, the FAA is allowing an exception to that rule that allows an operator to fly higher than 400 feet as long as they stay within 400 feet of a structure. However, there is one caveat that isn't mentioned here that is very important and often overlooked or misunderstood. Let's look at an example. So let's say that we've been hired to do a drone inspection on a 700-foot building. Part 107 says that as long as we stay within 400 feet of this building, we can go up to 400 feet above the uppermost point. So in this case, that would allow us to fly up to 1,100 feet AGL. So the caveat to this rule that I want to mention is that you can do this only if you are in uncontrolled airspace. If you are in controlled airspace, the altitude that the FAA allows you to fly up to is an absolute limit, and you cannot add that to any structures or building heights. So in uncontrolled airspace, you can add up to 400 feet above a structure or a building's uppermost limit. In controlled airspace, you cannot do that anymore. You are given an altitude limit that is a hard limit on what you are granted. So those are just a few topics that I find can be confusing or misunderstood by a lot of drone pilots. I'm sure there are many other topics that drone pilots might find confusing. What common misinformation do you see amongst drone pilots? Feel free to leave a comment with those in the comments below. And maybe we'll make a follow-up video to some of those as well. If you learned something from this video or found it helpful in any way, please consider giving it a thumbs up or leave a comment. Also, feel free to share this video with anyone you think would find the information helpful. If you happen to be living in the Cleveland, Ohio area, we have a Part 107 exam prep class that we are holding on January 27 and 28th. This is a in-person training, 2 days, 8 hours a day. If you're looking to become a professional drone pilot and want to get your Part 107 certificate, this would be an excellent class to not only get you up to speed on FAA regulations, but also prepare you to pass the Part 107 knowledge exam. You can find more information on the classes and services we offer on our website at www.v1dronemedia.com. And I'll also leave links below for those as well if you want to check it out. Thanks for watching, and you'll see me in the next one.